The silence in the Roberts household was never truly silent. That morning, it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Margaret sat stiffly at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a lukewarm cup of coffee she had long forgotten to drink. The clock on the wall ticked like a hammer against her ribs, every second pounding louder than the last. Edward had come home late again. His suit jacket was draped carelessly across the sofa, his tie hung loose as though strangling him, and his shoes lay abandoned by the door. He had staggered into their bedroom the night before, collapsing into bed without so much as a kiss goodnight. Once, that snoring sound that followed would have reassured Margaret of safety, of love. Now it felt like mockery, like a lullaby for fools. But what unsettled her most was not the fatigue written across her husband's face, nor the bitter scent of whiskey on his breath. It was the faint trace of something floral, a perfume that did not belong in her house. A scent too young, too bold, too foreign. Margaret's eyes had fallen on his phone, carelessly left on the nightstand. Edward hated technology. He never used email, never texted beyond a terse, "I'll be late." Yet the screen glowed with an unread message. Against every instinct, she reached for it. What she found clawed at her chest with icy fingers. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." Her heart stopped. The word Dad echoed in her head like a cruel taunt. Who would dare write such a thing, and with such intimacy? She scrolled down, but there was no name, no familiar contact. Just a string of meaningless characters, an email address born to hide. Margaret felt her breath catch, as though the ground beneath her had tilted. She looked back toward the bedroom. Edward slept soundly, his face slack with innocence, a picture of peace, but Margaret saw only guilt. She set the phone down carefully, her fingers trembling so hard she nearly dropped it. The room felt colder, as if winter itself had crept into her kitchen. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and she knew with a wife's intuition that she had stumbled upon the first thread of a web far darker than she was ready to face. Margaret stood in the kitchen long after the coffee in her cup had gone cold. The words from that email gnawed at her, each syllable echoing in her head like a cruel chorus. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." It wasn't simply the message itself, it was the intimacy, the confidence, the unashamed boldness of it. Whoever had sent it was not afraid of being discovered. That realization was far worse than the words on the glowing screen. Her body moved almost mechanically as she began picking up Edward's discarded things from the night before. His jacket lay slumped on the sofa like the husk of a man she no longer recognized. She brushed her hand against the fabric, and there it was again, that faint but unmistakable perfume. Not her soft rose scent, the one she had worn since their honeymoon, but something sharper, sweeter, almost defiant. Margaret pressed the sleeve to her nose. The fragrance was young, foreign, and wildly out of place in a house that had been built on 40 years of loyalty. She forced herself to put the jacket away, but her hands were trembling now. She moved to gather his trousers from the floor, and as she slid her fingers into the pocket to check for loose change or papers, she found a folded receipt. Her stomach dropped. It was from a steakhouse in San Antonio, dated that very evening. Edward had told her he was meeting partners in Dallas. Margaret's lips twisted into a bitter smile. Edward despised driving to Dallas. He always complained about the traffic, the noise, the chaos. But San Antonio had been his mother's city, a place of warm childhood memories and long-forgotten ties. Why would a supposed business meeting take place there? She unfolded the slip of paper further. 2 entrees, filet mignon and pasta. A bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, the same wine he had once bought for their 10th anniversary, a wine whose taste was forever etched in her memory. Margaret's chest tightened as she recalled the flickering candlelight of that evening, the way Edward had toasted her success when she opened her first bakery. Now that memory felt poisoned, a cruel echo of a love that may have never been real. She snapped a quick photo of the receipt with her phone, her hands shaking. It wasn't proof enough, but it was a beginning, a seed of suspicion she could not ignore. Moving through the living room, she collected the rest of his belongings. His old leather wallet, worn but familiar, sat heavy in her palm. She flipped it open. The usual credit cards, the driver's license, the photo of Michael in his firefighter uniform. It was all there, ordinary, routine. Yet Margaret felt like an intruder in her own husband's life, searching for cracks in the foundation of a home she had thought unshakable. Her gaze fell on his briefcase by the sofa. She opened it, rifling through the neat stack of contracts and papers. Everything looked pristine, almost too pristine, organized with a precision that Edward never bothered with. Margaret frowned. She closed it quickly, afraid of leaving evidence of her search, but a chill crawled up her spine. She turned to his laptop next, though Edward hardly ever used it. The machine hummed to life with surprising speed. She scanned the screen but found nothing unusual. Empty inboxes, cleared histories, sterile folders, too clean, too deliberate. It was the silence of someone who had learned to erase every trace of guilt. Margaret's chest felt hollow. She had always trusted Edward. Through lean years, through arguments, through the daily grind of building their bakery into something respected in their town, she had believed him to be her partner, her anchor. Now she wasn't sure if she had been living beside a stranger all along. She carried his clothes toward the laundry room, her legs heavy. As she checked the pockets one last time, her fingers closed around something small and slick. She pulled it out and froze. It was a tube, half empty, with dried residue clinging stubbornly to the cap. The label left no doubt, personal lubricant. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at it in disbelief, her hands trembling. She and Edward hadn't been intimate in years. He always brushed her off with excuses, too tired, too old, too stressed. So what was this for? The question reverberated in her mind like a hammer blow. Margaret placed the tube back exactly where she had found it, as though handling a snake that might bite. She scrubbed her hands raw with a napkin, then with soap, trying to wash away the betrayal clinging to her skin. But no amount of lemon-scented suds could erase the sting in her chest. Her instincts screamed now, louder than ever. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't imagination. Something dark, something vile was happening behind her back. She remembered her mother's words from long ago. A wife always knows. Even when the world doesn't believe her, she knows. Margaret returned to the garage later that night, flashlight in hand, her heart pounding like a thief's. She scanned Edward's SUV carefully. Loose change in the console, an empty water bottle under the seat. Harmless. Ordinary. But when she reached into the glove compartment, her fingers brushed against the same tube she had seen earlier, the same damning proof. Beside it, crumpled napkins, heavy with that floral perfume. The scent was almost suffocating in the confined space of the car. She snapped photos of everything, the tube, the napkins, even the interior of the car. Each click of her phone camera was like driving another nail into the coffin of her marriage. She closed the glove box gently, restoring the scene as if untouched. Standing in the garage, surrounded by shadows, Margaret felt her world tilt. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of trust, 40 years of building a life together, now unraveling strand by strand. She leaned against the cold metal of the car door, her breath ragged. For the first time in her life, Margaret admitted the truth to herself. Edward was hiding something, and that something was big enough to destroy not just their marriage, but their family. The morning after her discovery, Margaret moved through the house like a ghost. Her body went through the motions of daily life, making coffee, buttering toast, watering the flowers in the window box. But her mind was elsewhere, spinning in a violent storm. Every breath she took was weighted with questions, every beat of her heart an echo of betrayal. Edward had left early, claiming yet another important meeting. He had kissed her lightly on the cheek before walking out the door, as if 40 years of marriage could still be papered over with a hollow gesture. Margaret had smiled faintly, masking the rage that simmered beneath her skin. She could smell that perfume again, clinging faintly to his shirt collar as he walked past her. He hadn't even tried to hide it. The moment the door shut, Margaret dropped the facade. Her hands shook as she cleaned the half-eaten breakfast from the table. I can't live like this, she thought. I need the truth. Not guesses, not suspicions. The truth, however ugly it may be. Her mind turned to Mrs. Clark, an old friend from her bakery days. Years ago, Mrs. Clark had whispered something that Margaret had laughed off at the time. If you ever need to know whether a man is faithful, I know someone who can help. A private investigator. Discreet, reliable. At the time, Margaret had chuckled, brushing it aside. Edward? Unfaithful? Impossible. He was steady, dependable, her rock. But now she was desperate. Her pride stung as she picked up her phone, her finger hovering over Mrs. Clark's number. It felt like an admission of failure, a confession that her marriage was collapsing under her nose. But she pressed dial anyway. Margaret? It's been so long. Mrs. Clark's warm voice flowed through the line, but Margaret's own voice faltered. Evelyn, She hesitated, swallowing the lump in her throat. I need Thomas's number. The investigator you mentioned once. I think Edward is hiding something from me. There was silence on the line. Mrs. Nat Clark did not rush to fill it. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, edged with sympathy. Oh, Margaret, I'm so sorry. I'll send you his information right away. You don't deserve this. Minutes later, Margaret's phone buzzed with a message. Mr. Harris, licensed private investigator. Call when ready. Her hands trembled as she tapped the number. It rang once, twice, and then a calm male voice answered. Harris speaking. Margaret cleared her throat. Mr. Harris, my name is Margaret Roberts. Mrs. Clark gave me your number. She faltered. How did one say this aloud? How did one distill 40 years of trust now crumbling into a single request? My husband is, I believe he's unfaithful, she finally said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Mr. Harris did not gasp or react with pity. His voice remained steady, professional. I understand. Would you be able to meet me this afternoon to discuss the matter in person? Margaret agreed, though her stomach churned. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Edward had eaten just an hour before. By noon, Margaret found herself in a small cafe downtown, tucked into a quiet corner away from prying eyes. The scent of roasted coffee usually soothed her, but today it only reminded her of sleepless nights, of bitter mornings spent alone. She clutched her purse tightly. Inside it, the photos she had taken, the email, the receipt, the damning tube of lubricant, the perfume-stained napkins. Each image felt like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. The door chimed, and she looked up. Mr. Harris was nothing like the trench-coated detectives of old movies. He was a middle-aged man, stocky but solid, wearing a plain blue shirt and carrying a worn leather notebook. His eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp as though they could peel away the layers of her soul. Mrs. Roberts? He asked. Margaret nodded, her throat dry. Yes. He sat across from her, his presence steady, grounded. Tell me everything, he said simply. Margaret slid the flash drive across the table. This is all I have. I'm not certain, but I think Edward is cheating on me. Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for the vulnerability that seeped through. But Mr. Harris only nodded, reviewing the images one by one on his tablet. His face betrayed nothing, but the quick scratch of his pen against paper told her he was absorbing every detail. The email, he murmured, the steakhouse receipt, the lubricant, and the napkins with perfume. He glanced up, his eyes sharp. This is not circumstantial, Mrs. Roberts. This is the beginning of a pattern. Margaret's stomach twisted. She had hoped, foolishly, that Harris might dismiss her fears, tell her she was overreacting. Instead, his certainty felt like a hammer driving the nail of reality deeper into her chest. I will start following Mr. Roberts this afternoon, Harris continued. We will get the answers you need, but you must be careful. Don't confront him yet. Don't let him know you suspect. Margaret nodded weakly. Her coffee sat untouched, growing cold between them. I just want the truth, whatever it is. Harris closed his notebook and gave her a look that was equal parts professional and compassionate. The truth always comes out, Mrs. Roberts. It's only a matter of time. That evening, Margaret walked home through the bustling streets, but she felt more alone than ever. The world moved around her, couples laughing on the sidewalks, children tugging at their mother's hands, waiters sweeping storefronts. To them, she was just another middle-aged woman heading home. But inside, she was unraveling. Her thoughts churned. She remembered Edward's younger days, when he had helped her haul sacks of flour into the bakery, when he had kissed her cheek dusted in sugar and told her she was his world. She remembered their wedding, her mother's gift of the clock that now ticked accusingly in her kitchen. Were those moments real, or had they been lies, carefully constructed to keep her blind? When she reached her house, the air inside felt heavier than usual, suffused with the faint remnants of that perfume. Edward's jacket was gone, his shoes lined neatly by the door. He was upstairs, his voice carrying faintly as he spoke on the phone. Margaret paused on the staircase, straining to listen. "Yes, I'll handle it," she heard him say. His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man hiding something. She doesn't suspect a thing. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She clutched the banister to steady herself, her mind racing. Who was he speaking to? Sophie? Another woman? Or someone involved in his so-called business deals? She tiptoed back down the stairs, retreating into the shadows of her own home. She couldn't let him see her shaken. Not now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. That night, lying in bed beside Edward's steady, deceitful snores, Margaret stared into the darkness. Her mind replayed Harris's words. The truth always comes out. She held on to them like a lifeline, because she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Edward Roberts's carefully crafted world of lies was about to collapse. The next evening, Margaret sat in the back corner of her bakery, pretending to review invoices. The familiar scent of flour and sugar filled the air, but it no longer brought her comfort. Every chime of the front door startled her. Every vibration of her phone sent her heart into her throat. At precisely 8:37 p.m., her phone buzzed. A message from Harris appeared on the screen. "Mrs. Roberts, I have something for you. Check your email." Margaret's fingers trembled as she unlocked the bakery's dusty office computer. The slow hum of the machine nearly drove her mad, each second stretching like an eternity. When her inbox finally loaded, she saw Harris's name, the subject line plain and cold, "Evidence, Day 1." She clicked it open. The first image froze her in place. Edward, her Edward, walking hand in hand with Sophie down a quiet street near San Antonio. Margaret zoomed in, her breath catching. Sophie's hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders, her face glowing with a smile that Margaret had never seen at family dinners. Edward leaned close, whispering something in her ear, and Sophie laughed, an intimate, careless laugh. Margaret's throat tightened. She could almost hear the sound, light and cruel, echoing through the sterile quiet of her office. Another image appeared. Edward holding open the door of a restaurant, Sophie slipping inside in a sleek black dress. The caption Harris had typed beneath the photo was matter-of-fact, clinical. Dinner for 2, candles and wine, no attempt at secrecy. Margaret's stomach churned. She remembered their own anniversaries, the quiet tables, the wine glasses clinking together in toasts. Now those gestures belonged to someone else, someone who should have been like a daughter to her. The final attachment was a short video. Margaret pressed play, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped the mouse. The footage was grainy but clear. Edward and Sophie seated at a corner table, leaning toward each other, their hands brushing across the white tablecloth. Edward's smile was tender, almost youthful, a smile Margaret hadn't seen in decades. Sophie touched his arm, whispering something that made him laugh, an open, hearty laugh that felt foreign, as if it belonged to another man entirely. Margaret's chest heaved. She slammed the laptop shut, pressing her hands to her face. The bakery around her seemed to tilt and sway, the scent of rising bread suddenly nauseating. 40 years of love, of trust, of sacrifice, mocked in a single evening's worth of photographs. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Harris. "This is only the beginning. I will continue surveillance. Be strong." Margaret swallowed hard. She wanted to scream, to throw the laptop across the room, to march into that restaurant and drag them both out into the street. But instead, she sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her face. When she finally stood, the bakery felt alien to her. The ovens, the counters, the racks of pastries, all of it represented the life she had built with Edward, the life he now sought to destroy. She turned off the lights and locked the door, her movements slow, deliberate. That night, lying in bed beside Edward's steady snore, Margaret replayed the images again and again in her mind. She could see Sophie's smile, hear Edward's laughter, feel the crushing weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest. But beneath the grief, another emotion stirred, cold, sharp, and unyielding. Rage. She whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling but resolute. "You think I don't know, Edward, but I do, and soon everyone will." 2 days later, just as the morning sun filtered weakly through the lace curtains of the bakery, Margaret's phone buzzed with another message from Harris. She had been kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour, when she read his words. "More evidence. You need to see this." Her stomach knotted. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the office, her heart hammering as she opened the email. The first photo was of Edward and Sophie standing outside a downtown law office. Edward wore his familiar gray suit, his posture relaxed, almost casual. Sophie stood beside him in a beige dress, oversized sunglasses covering half her face. They were too close, too comfortable. The way lovers moved, not in-laws. Margaret scrolled down to the next attachment. The sight nearly made her knees buckle. Edward and Sophie walking into a 4-star hotel, its glass doors gleaming in the afternoon light. Margaret zoomed in on their faces. Edward's expression was soft, almost tender, while Sophie leaned toward him as though the world around them didn't exist. Then came a video clip. Harris must have been filming from a distance, but the footage was clear enough. Edward and Sophie stood on a balcony, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. Sophie tilted her head against his shoulder, her hair catching the light like strands of gold. And then, with a brazenness that stole Margaret's breath, they kissed. Not a quick, nervous brush of lips, but a kiss that spoke of familiarity, of stolen nights and whispered promises. Margaret slammed her hand against the desk, her breath ragged. She wanted to look away, but her eyes betrayed her, forcing her to watch again and again. The man she had built a life with, the man who had promised to cherish her until death, was now pouring all his tenderness into the arms of her son's wife. Her phone buzzed again. Harris had sent one more file, an audio recording. Margaret hesitated, her thumb hovering over the play button, but then pressed it, bracing herself. The voices that spilled into the room froze her blood. "Dad, hurry up with that fake contract." Sophie's voice whispered, cold and sharp, nothing like the sweet daughter-in-law Margaret thought she knew. "I want that bakery chain signed over already. I want the old hag out of the house." There was a pause, then Edward's voice, steady, confident, utterly damning. "Don't worry, Juliet doesn't know a thing. She trusts me too much. Leave it to me." The words hit Margaret like a knife to the chest. This wasn't just an affair. It was a plot, a calculated plan to strip her of everything she had sacrificed for. The bakery was hers, born from years of early mornings and sleepless nights. Her blood and sweat poured into every loaf, every contract, every expansion. Edward had never cared for it, never lifted a hand in the kitchen. And now he wanted to take it from her, hand it to Sophie, and erase her from the life she had built. Margaret's hands shook as she paused the recording, her breath uneven. Rage surged through her veins, hot and cold at once. She pressed play again, forcing herself to listen, to memorize every syllable. The betrayal was complete. Not only had Edward broken his vows, not only had Sophie desecrated her marriage to Michael, but together they had decided to destroy Margaret's life's work. She copied the files to a flash drive, labeling it with the date and time, each keystroke deliberate, almost ritualistic. It was her way of reclaiming control, of grounding herself in the chaos. When she finally stepped back into the bakery, the smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, but it no longer comforted her. She looked at the ovens, the counters, the trays of pastries cooling on the racks, and for the first time she did not feel pride. She felt fury. Her eyes hardened. Harris's words echoed in her mind. The truth always comes out. Now she had more than the truth. She had proof, and soon, she thought, Edward and Sophie would learn what it meant to betray Margaret Roberts. Margaret had spent the night pacing the kitchen, the shadows of the cabinet stretching long and thin in the dim light. The evidence Harris had sent her still burned in her mind. The kiss on the balcony, the recording of Edward and Sophie plotting to take everything from her. Each memory was a blade twisting deeper, but the pain was no longer paralyzing. It was clarifying. By dawn, grief had hardened into resolve. She was no longer the weeping wife clinging to 40 years of lies. She was a woman preparing for war. She stood at the counter, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. The bitter liquid steadied her as she whispered to herself, "If they want to destroy me, then I'll be the one to burn their world first." Her eyes shifted toward the garage. Edward's SUV sat there, quiet and still, like a guilty accomplice. She set her cup down, wiped her hands on a towel, and retrieved the spare set of car keys. The cool metal in her palm felt like a trigger. With careful, measured steps, Margaret entered the garage. The smell of gasoline lingered faintly, mingled with the ghost of Sophie's perfume. She opened the passenger side door, slid into the seat, and pulled open the glove compartment. Her fingers brushed against the familiar object, the tube of lubricant. Margaret stared at it, her lips tightening. It had become the symbol of their betrayal, the tangible proof of everything she had lost. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled it out, carrying it into the kitchen like a surgeon holding a scalpel. From the drawer beneath the sink, she retrieved a tube of industrial superglue, the kind she had once used to repair a broken chair in the bakery. She unscrewed the cap, her hands steady now, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. One by one, she squeezed the glue into the lubricant tube, filling it until it was nearly brimming. She shook it gently, wiped the nozzle clean, and screwed the cap back on. At a glance, it was indistinguishable from the original, a perfect deception. Margaret held it up to the light, studying her work. Her reflection stared back at her in the glossy plastic, older, harder, unrecognizable from the woman who once believed Edward was incapable of betrayal. She slid the tube back into the glove compartment, arranging everything exactly as it had been. No detail could betray her touch. As she stepped back into the house, her heart no longer raced. It beat steady, strong. She was not afraid anymore. That evening, Edward returned home, muttering about another long day, tossing his keys onto the counter. Margaret greeted him with the calmness of a woman who had learned to wear masks better than he ever could. She cooked his favorite dinner, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and gravy, and listened as he spoke in his usual monotone about meetings and contracts. Every word dripped with lies, but she smiled, nodding at the right moments, her voice warm and even. Inside, however, she was taking inventory. His habits, his routines, the places he carelessly left his phone and keys. Each detail mattered now. Each would be a piece of the trap she was building. Later that night, when Edward had collapsed into bed, snoring almost instantly, Margaret moved quietly through the house. She retrieved a small digital recorder from a box in the closet, a gift she had once bought for Michael during his college days. She replaced the batteries, tested the red blinking light, and smiled grimly when it came to life. She slipped into the bedroom and crouched by the headboard. With practiced precision, she taped the recorder behind the bookshelf, just enough to catch every sound, every whisper. She draped a family photo frame across the wires, hiding them beneath an image of happier times. Michael's wedding, Sophie smiling, Edward's arm around Margaret's shoulders. Her stomach churned as she looked at the photo, but she forced herself to keep steady. Soon, the truth would be caught in this very room. The next morning, Margaret carried out the second stage of her plan. In the kitchen, she set a heavy skillet on the stove and poured oil into it. She tied a thin string to the igniter, threading it across the counter and fastening it to a weighted coffee tin near the window. A single tug from afar would spark the flame, ignite the oil, and send thick smoke curling out into the air. It wouldn't be a real fire, just enough to look terrifying. enough to make the neighbors panic, enough to bring Michael and his fire crew rushing through the front door, enough to expose Edward and Sophie in the most humiliating way possible. Margaret tested it once. She pulled the string gently, and the stove flared, the oil spitting angrily before smoke began to rise. She turned it off immediately, waving the air clear with a towel, her lips curved into the faintest smile. The trap was perfect. She reset everything carefully, hiding the string, making sure nothing looked unusual. To Edward, it would be just another day in their house. But to Margaret, it was a battlefield now, every room armed with secrets. That night, as she lay beside Edward, Margaret listened to the rhythm of his snores. Her mind no longer lingered on the love they had once shared. Those memories had become ashes. Instead, she thought of the moment to come, the moment the world would see Edward and Sophie for who they truly were. Her rage was no longer wild and consuming. It was controlled, sharpened into a weapon. She whispered into the dark, her voice a vow. "You've taken everything from me, Edward. Now I'll take everything from you." The morning of the trap arrived cloaked in ordinary stillness, but Margaret felt the tension humming beneath her skin. She had rehearsed every step of her plan 100 times in her mind. The stove was prepared, the string tied to the igniter, the oil ready to burst into smoke. The recorder was hidden in the bedroom, poised to capture every whispered secret. And the tube in Edward's car was no longer lubricant, but a chamber of hardened betrayal, industrial glue in disguise. Edward had left early, murmuring something about a meeting with partners. He hadn't noticed Margaret's steady gaze following him to the door. If he suspected anything, he didn't show it. He kissed her cheek, his lips brushing her skin without warmth, then disappeared into the morning. By noon, Margaret packed a large purse and crossed the street to Mrs. Brown's house. The older woman opened the door, surprised to see her neighbor so early. "Margaret, what's going on?" "I need to stay here for a while," Margaret whispered, forcing a small smile. "Edward thinks I'm traveling for business, but I need to watch something from here." Mrs. Brown studied her for a moment, but didn't press. She poured a cup of coffee and led Margaret to a window overlooking the Roberts' home. From there, Margaret could see the front door clearly, the place where everything would unravel. The minutes crawled. Margaret's eyes never left the street. At 2:10, a taxi pulled up to the curb. Sophie stepped out, her hair loose and shimmering, her dress light and floral. She wore sunglasses, but nothing could disguise the quick glance of anticipation on her face. She looked too young, too bold, walking toward the house that was supposed to be her sanctuary as a daughter-in-law. Edward opened the door almost immediately, ushering her inside with a nervous glance around the neighborhood. To any passerby, it looked like nothing more than a polite gesture. But Margaret knew. She tightened her grip on the coffee cup, her knuckles white. She pulled out her phone and opened the recorder's app. Instantly, Sophie's laugh rang through her earbuds, carried from the hidden device in the bedroom. Margaret's stomach turned as she heard Edward's voice, deep and relaxed. "We don't have to sneak around anymore. The old hag's gone for the day." Sophie's reply was a cruel dagger. "Finally, your house feels like ours now." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. Not yet, she told herself. Wait for the right moment. Inside the house, the sounds grew more intimate. The bed creaked. Whispered words of mockery spilled from Sophie's mouth. Margaret forced herself to listen, each word feeding the cold fury inside her. Then suddenly, Sophie's voice turned sharp, panicked. "What the hell is this? We're stuck!" Edward cursed, his voice tight with frustration. "Stop moving. Just give me a second." Margaret's lips curved into the faintest smile. The glue had worked. It was time. She reached for the string tied discreetly to her phone stand and tugged. In the kitchen across the street, the stove ignited. The oil caught, and within seconds, thick black smoke billowed upward, curling out the kitchen window like a signal fire. "Margaret, your house," Mrs. Brown gasped, standing. "Yes," Margaret said evenly, her eyes fixed on the scene. "Call it in." Neighbors spilled out of their homes, shouting, pointing. "Fire!" Call the fire department." Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the street. The fire truck screeched to a halt in front of the Roberts house, and leading the charge was Michael, her son, his face grim beneath his fire chief's helmet. Margaret's heart clenched at the sight of him. He had no idea what he was about to walk into. He thought he was coming to save his parents' home. Instead, he was about to confront the ruin of his family. Through her earbuds, Margaret heard Sophie's desperate cries. "Edward, do something. We can't move." Edward growled, his voice ragged. "Shut up. Just stay quiet." But it was too late. The door burst open under Michael's sledgehammer, and firefighters flooded the hallway. Shouts echoed through the house. Then silence. Heavy, horrified silence as they reached the bedroom. Margaret didn't need to see it. She could hear Michael's voice, sharp and broken all at once. What the hell is this?" A younger firefighter muttered in disbelief. "Oh my God." Another let out a nervous laugh before Michael barked, "Quiet." Margaret's chest tightened. Her son's pain was unfolding in real time, and she could do nothing but watch from across the street. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. This was the price of truth. Neighbors clustered around the front yard, murmuring, whispering, pointing. Phones came out. Mrs. Brown lifted hers too, recording silently. The humiliation was spreading already, a wildfire no hose could extinguish. When the firefighters finally carried Edward and Sophie out, wrapped awkwardly in sheets, the neighborhood erupted in gasps and cries of disgust. Sophie sobbed, her voice shrill. Edward muttered curses, his face pale with rage and shame. Margaret stood at Mrs. Brown's window, her heart steady despite the chaos. The trap had been sprung. The world now knew the truth. The ambulance screamed through the streets, red lights flashing across the neighborhood, carrying with it not only Edward and Sophie, but also the shattered remnants of Margaret's family. Neighbors still lingered in clusters, whispering in tones of disbelief. Some shook their heads in pity, others smirked with cruel satisfaction. The scandal was no longer confined to whispers behind closed doors. It was public, raw, irreversible. Margaret walked behind Mrs. Brown as the two women made their way to the hospital. She kept her face carefully composed, feigning the expression of a shocked wife, a woman blindsided by a sudden tragedy. Inside, however, her heart was cold steel. She had orchestrated this moment, and she would see it through to the end. The hospital corridors buzzed with controlled chaos. Nurses moving briskly, doctors speaking in low voices, monitors beeping steadily. Margaret sat quietly in the third-floor waiting area, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her purse resting by her feet. To anyone watching, she was the dutiful wife, waiting anxiously for word of her husband. But her eyes betrayed nothing. Hours dragged by until finally a doctor emerged, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Mrs. Roberts," he said gently, "we managed to separate them. Fortunately, there's no lasting damage. They'll need ointment for skin irritation, but they should recover." Margaret nodded solemnly, masking the flicker of triumph that surged through her veins. "Thank you, doctor. May I see them?" He led her down the hallway to a small room. Nurses bustled inside, preparing 2 beds side by side. Sophie lay pale and trembling, her eyes red from tears. Edward sat propped up, his face ashen, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Juliet, Margaret," he began, his voice hoarse, "I can explain." But Margaret cut him off with a raised hand. "Save your strength," she murmured softly, her tone layered with false concern. The nurse handed her 2 tubes of ointment. "For the burns and irritation," she explained. "Please apply twice a day." Margaret thanked her, her hands steady as stone. When the nurse's back was turned, Margaret slipped the ointment into her purse and replaced it with the 2 tubes of mustard she had prepared earlier. The exchange was seamless, invisible to untrained eyes. She placed the tubes on the bedside table. "For the pain," she said evenly. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. Moments later, piercing screams echoed through the hallway. Sophie's voice was shrill, ragged. "It burns! My skin! It's on fire!" Edward's bellow followed, filled with rage and agony. "What the hell is this?" Nurses rushed into the room, alarms sounding as chaos erupted. Margaret remained seated in the waiting area, her hands folded, her face calm. Around her, relatives of other patients whispered, eyes widening as gossip spread like wildfire. "Isn't that the couple from the neighborhood scandal?" someone murmured. "Yes, the father-in-law and the daughter-in-law. Unbelievable." "They deserve whatever's happening," another voice added coldly. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, savoring the chorus of condemnation. Later that evening, the hallway quieted, though tension still lingered. Margaret returned to the room, her steps measured, her expression carefully sympathetic. Edward glared at her from the bed, his face contorted with pain. "Margaret," he rasped, "you don't understand. Sophie and I—" But Margaret silenced him with a single, icy stare. "Don't speak," she whispered. "You've said enough already." Sophie wept quietly, her once perfect hair a tangled mess, her face streaked with humiliation. She turned her pleading eyes toward Margaret. "Please," she sobbed. "Forgive me. I made a mistake." Margaret said nothing. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She placed it on the bedside table between them, her movements deliberate, final. Edward frowned. "What's this?" Margaret's voice was calm, almost detached. 40 years of marriage end here. Divorce papers. Sign them. And then both of you do whatever you want, so long as you disappear from my life and from Michael's. The silence that followed was suffocating. Edward's lips moved as though searching for words, but nothing came. Sophie's sobs grew louder, echoing off the sterile hospital walls. Margaret stood, adjusting her coat, her gaze sweeping over them one last time. "You've humiliated me. You've betrayed our son, and you've tried to take what I built with my own hands. You thought you could burn my life to ashes." She paused, her eyes hard as glass. "But it's you who will carry the scars." She turned on her heel and walked out, her footsteps echoing like gavel strikes. In the hallway, Michael leaned against the wall, his head buried in his hands. His firefighter's uniform was streaked with ash, his face pale and drawn. He didn't look up when Margaret approached. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking, "why did it have to be Dad? Why her?" Margaret's throat tightened. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch firm but trembling. "I don't have the answers, Michael. But I promise you this. We'll survive. We'll rebuild. Together." Michael finally lifted his eyes, red-rimmed but resolute. He nodded once, a soldier bracing himself for the battles ahead. Margaret pulled him into an embrace, holding on as though she could shield him from the wreckage of their family. She whispered into his ear, steady and fierce, "They tried to destroy us, but they failed. We still have each other." For the first time in days, Margaret felt a flicker of warmth. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was survival. And survival, she knew, was the first step toward triumph. The weeks that followed the hospital scandal were a blur of whispers, stares, and gossip that rippled through every corner of their town. Edward and Sophie could not escape it. Their names had become synonymous with shame. Neighbors avoided them in public, some crossing the street to steer clear. Others weren't so discreet, muttering sharp words under their breath, letting their disgust echo in grocery aisles and cafes. Margaret heard it all, not because she sought it out, but because the story was impossible to avoid. Mrs. Brown brought her updates daily, eyes wide as she recounted the latest rumor, how Sophie had been spotted at the pharmacy, hiding behind dark glasses, how Edward had tried to visit an old business partner, only to be turned away at the door, how people still replayed the video Mrs. Brown had captured of the fire truck arriving at Margaret's house. Margaret listened quietly, her face composed, but inside she carried a complex storm. There was satisfaction, yes, justice had been served, but there was also sorrow for the life she had once believed in, for the family portrait that could never be mended. At home, Michael had moved in permanently. The first few days were heavy with silence. He spent long hours at the fire station, returning home exhausted, his face shadowed by grief. Margaret cooked simple meals, soup, bread, roasted chicken, and they ate together quietly, each lost in thought. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, Michael finally spoke. "Mom," he said softly, his voice raw, "I can't stop seeing it. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, Dad and Sophie. I hear the whispers from the crew, even when they don't say a word. I feel humiliated. Margaret reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. Michael, you did nothing wrong. Their choices don't define you. He gave a bitter laugh. Don't they? I was proud of my family, proud of the example my father set. Now I wonder if it was all a lie. Margaret's throat tightened. She squeezed his hand gently. It wasn't all a lie. We had years of love, years of building this bakery, years of laughter. That was real, even if he destroyed it later. You can't erase the good, Michael, but you can learn from the betrayal. Michael stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It wasn't acceptance yet, but it was a step. The bakery became their refuge. Customers continued to come, more than ever before. Word of Margaret's strength had spread beyond their neighborhood. People admired her resilience, her ability to stand tall despite the scandal that would have broken most women. Juliet, you're an inspiration, Mrs. Peterson said one afternoon as she bought her usual pastries. Everyone's talking about how you defended your life, your business. You didn't let them take it from you. Margaret smiled faintly, wrapping the pastries with steady hands. I just did what I had to do. Inside, though, she felt a strange mixture of pride and weariness. She hadn't asked to be anyone's inspiration. She had simply fought to survive. But if her story gave other women strength, then perhaps some good could come from the wreckage. Michael helped more at the bakery now. He handled invoices, negotiated with hotel managers, even learned how to bake some of the simpler pastries. Margaret often watched him behind the counter, his tall frame bent over trays of bread, his expression serious but calmer than before. Slowly, his wounds were healing. Meanwhile, Edward and Sophie vanished into near seclusion. They stayed mostly indoors, curtains drawn, the once proud Edward reduced to a ghost in his own house. Sophie, Margaret heard, had begged Michael for forgiveness, but he had refused to see her. One evening, Margaret received a letter in Edward's handwriting. She stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Juliet, it began, I know I have no right to ask for anything. I destroyed everything we built together. But please believe me when I say I never stopped loving you. I was weak, I was foolish, I was tempted, and I failed. I've lost everything now, and I don't know how to go on. Margaret folded the letter neatly and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She felt no urge to respond. Love without respect was nothing, and his words meant less than the ashes of the life he had burned. Spring arrived, and with it came renewal. The bakery's garden bloomed with fresh herbs and flowers. Children stopped by for sweet rolls after school, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in months, Margaret felt lightness returning. One Sunday, she and Michael walked to church together. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, painting the pews with colors. Margaret sat quietly, letting the light wash over her. She did not pray for Edward or Sophie. She prayed for Michael, for herself, for the strength to keep moving forward. Afterward, as they walked home, Michael glanced at her. Mom, do you ever regret it? What you did? Margaret thought for a long moment before answering. No, they were going to destroy everything. I simply refused to let them. Sometimes, Michael, survival requires us to fight in ways we never imagined. Michael nodded, his face thoughtful. Then I'll fight with you. For the bakery. For our future. For the first time since the betrayal, Margaret smiled fully. Months later, the scandal had begun to fade from the town's daily gossip, but its shadow remained. Edward and Sophie had lost their reputations, their family, and any chance of reclaiming respect. Margaret, on the other hand, stood stronger than ever. Her bakery thrived, her bond with Michael deepened, and though the scars of betrayal would never disappear, they no longer defined her. She was more than a victim. She was a survivor, a builder, a woman who refused to be erased. One evening, as she closed the bakery, Margaret looked out at the setting sun, the sky ablaze with gold and crimson. She thought of the girl she had once been in San Diego, hopeful, trusting, believing in forever. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in fire, tempered by betrayal and unbroken by loss. She whispered softly to the empty street, her words carried away on the evening breeze. "You tried to bury me, Edward, but I was the seed." And with that, she turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked home beside her son, ready for whatever came next. The seasons turned, as they always did. Summer rolled into autumn, and autumn into winter. But for Margaret, time felt different now, sharper, heavier, and yet strangely liberating. Every morning she unlocked the bakery, her hands steady, her mind clear. The scent of warm bread and cinnamon filled the air before dawn, rising like a promise of survival. The bakery had always been her refuge, but now it had become something greater, a sanctuary of resilience. Customers flocked not only for the pastries, but for the story behind them. They whispered her name with respect, admiring the woman who had endured betrayal and humiliation, yet still stood tall. Margaret greeted them all with the same gentle smile, never indulging in gossip, never boasting of her victory. She didn't need to. Her survival spoke louder than any rumor. Michael adapted quickly to his new role as her partner. At first, his presence was shadowed by grief. He moved through tasks mechanically, kneading dough, balancing accounts, stocking shelves. But slowly, with each day, he began to reclaim himself. One Saturday morning, as he carried a tray of fresh croissants to the front counter, a group of schoolchildren rushed in, their faces alight with excitement. "Chief Roberts, you work here now?" one of them exclaimed, pointing at Michael. Michael laughed for the first time in weeks, a sound Margaret had almost forgotten. "That's right," he said, setting the tray down. "When I'm not putting out fires, I'm baking bread." The children giggled, and Margaret watched as a piece of her son's spirit returned. The bakery wasn't just saving her, it was saving him too. Meanwhile, Edward and Sophie had become ghosts. The house across town where they tried to hide was dark most nights, the curtains drawn tight. Margaret occasionally caught whispers, Edward seen staggering out of a liquor store, Sophie arguing with him in the parking lot of a motel. Their downfall was complete. The once proud Edward Roberts, who had strutted into restaurants with his shoulders back and his smile polished, was now a man stripped of everything: respect, family, dignity. Sophie, once admired for her beauty, was now known only for her betrayal. Margaret did not gloat. She did not need to. Their punishment was ongoing, woven into the fabric of their everyday existence. Every look of disdain from a neighbor, every cruel laugh from a stranger, was a reminder that they had chosen this path. One crisp winter evening, Margaret and Michael closed the bakery together. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes swirling under the street lamps. They walked home side by side, the crunch of snow beneath their boots. "Mom," Michael said quietly, "do you ever wish things had turned out differently? That Dad had chosen us instead of her?" Margaret thought for a long moment, her breath clouding the cold night air. "Wishing won't change the past," she said finally. "What matters is what we do now. We've lost a family, yes, but we've gained something too, a chance to rebuild, to redefine who we are without him." Michael nodded, his expression serious but peaceful. "Then let's make it count." Margaret slipped her arm through his, and together they walked into the night, two survivors carrying each other forward. As spring returned, the town prepared for its annual festival. The streets were strung with lights, booths lined with food and crafts, and music drifted through the air. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to join. She set up a stand filled with her famous flan, her pastries shining under the lanterns. Customers crowded around, eager not just for the sweets, but for a glimpse of the woman whose strength had become a legend. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking for the lady's bread. Teenagers whispered her name with admiration. Elderly women squeezed her hands, telling her she was proof that no betrayal could break a woman's spirit. Margaret smiled through it all, her heart swelling not with pride but with quiet gratitude. She had not sought to be anyone's symbol. She had only fought for survival. Yet here she was, stronger than ever. Later that evening, as the festival wound down, Margaret stood at her booth watching the lanterns float into the night sky. One by one they rose higher, glowing against the darkness, each carrying wishes from the townsfolk. She closed her eyes and whispered her own silent prayer. Not for Edward, not for Sophie, but for Michael, for herself, for the bakery, for the simple gift of peace. When she opened her eyes, Michael was standing beside her, a lantern in his hands. He handed it to her gently. "For you, Mom," he said. Together, they released it into the night. It floated upward, steady and bright, disappearing into the constellation of lights above. Margaret watched until it was gone, then turned to her son. "We made it," she whispered. Michael smiled, his eyes glistening. "Yes, we did." And in that moment, Margaret realized the truth she had been searching for all along. Betrayal could shatter, yes, but it could also forge something stronger. She had been broken, but she had rebuilt. She had been abandoned, but she had endured. She had been humiliated, but she had risen. She was no longer just Margaret Roberts, the wife of Edward, the mother-in-law of Sophie. She was Margaret, survivor, creator, fighter, and mother, and no one could take that from her again. 3 years had passed since the day smoke poured from the Roberts house and Edward's secret with Sophie was exposed to the entire neighborhood. Time had softened the raw wounds, but the memory of betrayal never truly faded. For Margaret, it remained like a scar, no longer bleeding, but always reminding her of the strength and resilience it had taken to survive. The bakery had grown from a single shop into a small chain of 3 locations spread across the city. Each carried the same essence, the sweet aroma of flan, golden loaves of bread, and warm greetings from staff. Customers often whispered, "Barcel, that's Margaret's bakery, the woman who rose from the ashes." Michael was no longer just a fire chief, but also the primary manager of the bakery business. He split his time between shifts at the fire station and overseeing operations. His hair had begun to show gray earlier than most, worn by stress, but his eyes were calmer now. He had learned acceptance, and more importantly, he no longer carried the shame of what his father and ex-wife had done. Meanwhile, Edward and Sophie had become outcasts. Rumors said they had left town, but Margaret occasionally heard whispers. Edward spotted stumbling out of a liquor store on the outskirts, his beard unkempt and eyes vacant. Sophie worked as a waitress in a dingy diner in a nearby city, living under the shadow of ridicule. No one referred to them by name anymore. They were simply symbols of betrayal, a cautionary tale that bad choices can destroy entire lives. Margaret sought no further revenge. Life had done the work for her, burying Edward and Sophie in contempt and isolation. In calmer days, Margaret joined a cooking club at the community center. Other women looked at her with admiration, often asking, "How did you survive it all, Margaret?" She would smile softly and reply, "Because I chose to stand up instead of staying down." Margaret also began writing her story, not out of spite, but to inspire. Her memoir, The Oven That Never Went Cold, was published by a local press. People bought it not just for curiosity, but for its message. A woman can lose everything and still find herself again. Michael, after years of heartbreak, had found new love. Clara, a fellow firefighter, understood his wounds without demanding he erase them. Their love grew slowly, without haste, but with steady strength. Clara often stopped by the bakery, bringing Margaret bouquets of wildflowers that made her laugh. One evening, Michael confided to his mother, "I thought I'd never love again, but Clara makes me realize love doesn't always betray. Sometimes it comes to heal." Margaret squeezed his hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "Your father and Sophie left darkness behind, but you found light. Don't be afraid, Michael. Walk into it." On the 10th anniversary of the bakery, customers filled the shop to bursting. They laughed, congratulated, and sang. Margaret, now in her 60s with silver hair but still upright and strong, stepped forward to thank them. "Thank you all for being here today," she said into the microphone, her voice ringing steady. Life sometimes tests us in the cruelest ways, but from fire we can be reborn. I stand here not because I never fell, but because I stood up again and again. The crowd erupted in applause. Michael stood proudly at her side, Clara's hand tightly in his. Margaret looked around, her heart calm. She no longer saw Edward's face among the crowd, nor did Sophie's name linger in the air. They had become the past, while she and her son stepped forward into the future. The celebration ended with the release of lanterns into the night sky. Margaret gazed upward, remembering the evening years ago when she and Michael had released just one lantern together. Tonight, dozens rose at once, glowing like stars against the darkness. Margaret whispered, "I was buried, but I bloomed from the ashes." And this time, she knew the new chapter of her life had truly begun.